We've got a panel of 3 fantastic guests. Each are going to do a short presentation, and then we're going to talk a little bit amongst ourselves and then open it up to you. And the discussion tonight's obviously going to focus on Yinka's work, but also the legacy of empire and the legacy of war. Yinka, MBE, one of the UK's greatest living contemporary artists. I hope all of you heard him on Desert Island Discs the other day on Radio 4. If you didn't, I urge you to catch up. He's got great taste in music. He grew up in London and Lagos. He was nominated for the Turner Prize in 2004 and became a member of the Royal Academy in 2013. And of course, probably best known, I think, to the public for Nelson's Ship in a Bottle, which was displayed on the 4th plinth in Trafalgar Square. And as he said on Radio 4, the question it made him recognisable to cab drivers in London. And the question he most often got asked by them was, how did you get that ship in a bottle? Meera Savaratnam is a lecturer in international relations at SOAS, the School of Oriental and African Studies in London, and her special area of interest is the colonial dimensions of world politics, and she's written extensively about colonialism, empire and race, and she teaches 1418 war to undergraduates, so she might have to pitch it a little bit lower for us, I think. But, caught one of them going to sleep, did you, this morning, I think? Or
not an undergraduate.
No. Barnaby Phillips is an award-winning journalist. He's been a TV and radio reporter for almost 25 years. We worked together at the BBC. He has now defected to Al Jazeera English, our loss, covering news and current affairs all over the world. But he's here tonight because he's written a fascinating book called Another Man's War, about a Nigerian soldier who fought with the British Army in Burma during World War II. And it was a story that Barnaby came across while he was working in Nigeria as a journalist. So you'll see all these threads will come together and all relate to Yinka's work. And I hope you'll have had a chance, you can hardly have missed them, to see Yinka's works on the way in here. And I would urge you, if you hadn't had time, to really go and study the British Library and have a look at all the names and even look some of them up on the computer terminals that are available there. Yinka is difficult to sum up as an artist because he works in sculpture and painting and photography and film, but there are unifying materials and themes, as you can see, that crop up all the time, particularly his use of the trademark brightly coloured batik fabric, which of course is a colonial invention produced by the Dutch for the Indonesian market and later introduced to West Africa. But before we go into the specifics of the 2 installations here at the Turner, Yinka is going to give you a bit of background on himself as an artist.
Well, thank you for coming to see my work and hear me speak. And of course, huge thank you to Turner Contemporary for inviting me here and all the staff and everyone who's worked on this project. This is not rehearsed, so I don't quite know what to say really about my work, but I think I'll just, for those of you who are not really familiar with my work, I studied at Byam School in London, and then I went to Goldsmiths College after that. But basically, I mean, what does an artist do? You go to art school, you're trying to figure out what to make work about. And, some of you may know the story. I started kind of just, doing life drawing and so on. Then came into my second year, decided, I'd had enough of, drawing and painting nudes. And I wanted to do, be much more politically engaged in the practice. And at the same time, feminism, identity politics, all those things were going on, within the art schools. So a lot of us were, looking at continental theory. And so, the kind of postmodernism, and we were all reading French theorists like Lacan, Derrida, and deconstruction. Anyway, now those of us interested in injustice, we realized that actually the kind of class struggle of Marxism was not going to be enough. The deconstruction of language or the challenging of language. So in other words, the stereotypes we use to define each other became the thing that a lot of artists wanted to challenge. So we wanted, in other words, wanted to actually challenge the status quo. And one way of doing that was to start to study representation itself. So then the work became about the politics of representation, the things that we represent things with, who created those things. And so it might sound horribly kind of theoretical, but actually it's very simple. You know, you look at somebody, you look at what they're wearing, you make assumptions about them. Those are the signs that kind of, represent them. So the work then, it's about actually taking all of those things, those stereotypes, and playing with them and deconstructing them. So that's basically where the whole thing started. But then, of course, I'm talking to an audience in my work. I want to engage with people. I then decided to add an element of fun and humor into that, and to find ways of making the work less boring to myself and less boring to my audience. So, and as I actually won't be speaking for too long, I'll just look at a few pieces, I'll talk about those, and then I'll hand over. So this is the British Library. This work was actually done initially for the Brighton Festival. At that time, already, people were talking about, migrants and whether to stay in Europe or, come out of Europe, and also the issue of, a number of Polish workers also coming to the UK at that time. Now, this piece was actually before the crisis in Syria. And then I really started to think about Britain as a whole and the makeup of Britain. I mean, people have come from, all kinds of places, really, and the various conflicts around the world, that's actually led to a lot of people needing to migrate, and people, of course, do migrate for economic reasons, too. And then, of course, because of the British Empire and the colonial encounter with, people from Africa, Asia, and so on, there are also a number of people who are here, and also people who came here to work. But a lot of those people have now become household names in Britain. I mean, while I was doing the research for this project, I actually discovered that Helen Mirren had her origins in Russia, and I didn't even know that. And so, as you go through the library, you'll see the names of people you might not have imagined, have their heritage elsewhere. And so can we go to the next one? So that's what the piece looked like in Brighton. And then I've got there's some information to go along with the piece. The computers show the names of people and what their professions are, and also some clips about the various conflicts that brought them to Britain. Okay, so we can go to the next. And this is a piece called Cannonball Heaven. Again, that's the cannonballs are just, they're soft, they're useless, really. They won't, particularly kill anyone. Again, that's also about the futility of war. So what I try to do in my work is to find ways of expressing or, dealing with very complex issues, but finding ways that might then, they're more like visual poetry, if you like. And this is the work that's got me famous with cab drivers in London. And every cab driver has got an opinion on what should go on that plinth. And so we have quite strong arguments and debates about it. And again, this is the power of art. When I actually worked on this piece, I liked being able to engage with people in public, because often with the museums, only a very small group of people see the work. But on the plinth, you can actually speak to literally millions of people. And this work is now outside the Greenwich Museum, the museum in Greenwich, the Maritime Museum in Greenwich, permanently. And that's, Nelson's ship, HMS Victory, in a bottle, and the sails are made out of the textiles that I use in my work.
You're not going to tell us how you do it then?
Nope. I'd have to kill you if I told you. And then this is another public work that was done in 1998. And it's just, a picture of myself as a dandy. In the 80s, I used to wear, in the 90s, I think, 80s and 90s, I used to wear some pretty sharp suits. And so that was a poster on the London Underground about, more than 40 stations in the London Underground. And it's a take on Hogarth's Rake's Progress, but reinterpreted. And that's another work about the futility of war, inspired by, actually, Gulliver's Travels. So there were some people fighting over which side to break their egg in the book. This is my tribute, or courtesy, if you like, to the banking crisis. When the banking crisis happened, I made this Last Supper piece. And again, this actually is in London, Howick Place, not too far from Victoria Station. And it's wind sculpture. So it's just like giant fabric blowing in the wind, That's all it is. But it's a fun piece. It looks like it's light, but it's heavy. So just playing with that. And also trying to see if I could actually sculpt wind.
What's it made out of, though?
Fiberglass. It's painted fiberglass. And that's all, folks, I guess.
So, Yinka, let's talk about the piece that you have been commissioned by 1418 to do here, the seesaw. I mean, fantastically placed, I think you all agree, in front of that window. It's spectacular. So when they approached you and said, could you do a piece for us, talk us through the sort of creative process of how you came up with that idea.
Well, I mean, when I was approached to make a piece for to commemorate the First World War, well, I mean, quite frankly, I think I was actually terrified because of the horror of the war itself. I mean, it's not, as you well know, a light subject. So I couldn't really, and I had to try and think of a more kind of reflexive way of thinking about that subject, a way that's not, because you can't necessarily be too literal or too didactic about it, because, families were affected. There are real people whose families were affected by that war. So, and also, people within the colonies were also hugely affected by this war. And literally millions of people died in this war. So I had to think about something that would be more about balance and about negotiation, about being prepared to compromise. So the piece is that there are two people on a seesaw, and at one point in the process of the movement, they come into balance. But then at other points, they go out of balance. And that's what negotiation is about. But you have to be prepared to go through that, through that turmoil in a way. But unfortunately, we're too quick to rush into war because we've not really experienced it. So we think it's going to fix everything. But actually in a war, nobody really wins. And so this is the best way I can think of to deal with such a weighty subject.
And tell us about the detail on the globes, because they're slightly different, aren't they, the head globes?
Yes, well, the globes kind of reflect because there were two major alliances in the First World War. So there's the, French, United Kingdom, and Russian Empire alliance, and there's the Austro-Hungarian, alliance, and Germany, and they confront each other. But within the bodies of the figures, the colonies are kind of present as well within the bodies of the figures. So it's the Waltz War, and so it's a confrontation between those two forces represented by those two separate spheres. Yeah.
And we see in that work, and we see in the slides that you've just showed us, the garb of the Victorian gentleman is something that recurs constantly in your work.
Yes.
And presumably that's because that's when Britain was at the height of its colonial ambitions.
Well, no, absolutely. And, of course, my own identity. I mean, I think I'd rather actually be having this conversation in Yoruba with you. But the British have kind of forced me to speak English, screaming, and I remember at school, if you spoke your own language, you'd be fined in Nigeria for doing that. And I think that the Victorian costumes, in a way, that's also started as a kind of a cheeky thing, really, because, Margaret Thatcher used to go on about Victorian values. And then that's when it first occurred to me, actually, to start ethnicizing the aristocracy.
I think the other thing that strikes me about all of your work is that you're getting us to think about, some pretty challenging political issues, but with humour and also with beauty, because, of course, those fabrics are very beautiful. You can't help but be drawn in by those colours.
Well, yes. I mean, I think that it's important that the art is engaging, and I think it's important that, yes, of course, it is dark, but I want to hold people's attention first so that they can then go further and see more. I don't want to make people defensive when they encounter the work.
So you draw them in with the beauty and the humour, and then you get them to think.
Well, that's the idea. Yes.
Works with me. The British Library, I think 6,000 books, over 6,000 names in all. I particularly enjoyed seeing Nigel Farage.
Oh, yes, absolutely, yes.
Huguenot or Norman, I think. Tony Blair's there as well. I just spotted him. Where did he come from originally?
I'm not entirely sure.
I'm going to quiz you on all these 6,000 now. But I mean, presumably an awful lot.
Are you sure where Tony Blair comes from?
Could be a whole artwork in itself. But huge amounts of research must have gone into this project, into sort of, getting all those names together.
No, I mean, absolutely, And I do thank my research assistants. I don't do it all myself, but a lot of research did go into it, yes.
And you're going to encourage people who come and see the exhibition here at the Turner, I think, to share some of their stories of immigration.
Yes, absolutely, yes. I think there's provision for that, I think, on the computers, but there's provision for that to share some of their own stories. Yes.
So presumably this is a sort of almost organic artwork it's grown since I first saw it in Brighton. I mean, it's going to could keep on getting larger and larger.
And also we should really spare thought for the Syrian immigrants and the issues around that. And we should also think about the motivations for, the kind of European arguments we're having at the moment as well. I mean, these issues they're very current, and and so it's important that people see the relevance. It's not something. It's certainly not finished. This process. Yeah.
Now I want to bring in our next panellist, Mira Sabaratnam, on this. I mean, first, Mira, I know you've got a short presentation for us, but can I just ask you for your reactions as a historian to Yinka's pieces here?
Yes, certainly. Thanks very much for having me. I think, so I'm actually in the discipline of international relations, which I'll say a bit about. But I think what's really great about Yinka's pieces is that they encapsulate very neatly the colonial constitution of the global order at that moment of the war. So it's very much, I mean, the way that I sort of saw the seesaw figures was reflecting partly that shifting European balance of power, which was something that they were all consciously trying to do, but also the idea of the imperial body as kind of being built on the body of colonial infrastructure and with the heads of this kind of imperial mindset. That's kind of what I took away from it. So I thought actually it really captured those really beautifully. And its sort of unending, perpetual shift was also very resonant with the kinds of things that we look at.
So, I mean, Mira, it's a very common misperception to see 1418 as a European conflict that was fought in France and Belgium to contain German militarism waged on the back of the common European conscript soldier. But, of course, all the European states that were involved in the war were imperial powers, exercising control over vast swathes of the globe. And I think you've prepared a presentation for us on how many troops from the British colony were, people around the world were engaged in that war, which is a somewhat forgotten story, I think, here in the UK.
So my discipline of international relations, to start off with, has its birth story in World War I. So the story goes, and this is how I was taught international relations, that in 1919, the first chair of international relations was established in the UK with money funded by a Welsh philanthropist, David Davies. And the point was to study the causes of war such that it should not recur again. So it very much comes out of a story about the need to end war, the need for some kind of compact, some kind of science to figure out how to avoid war. Now, scholarship since then has unpacked that a little bit, but that's where it sits in the discipline. That discipline also has taken nation states as its basic unit of analysis, and that's how we think about the world, as cut up into sovereign states, each with their own borders and territories and populations. But actually, I think if we look at the world in 1914, all of the major players involved in that war were empires rather than what we might call nation states. And I think this is a really important thing to understand when we're trying to grasp what the war was about. One of the key ways in which we think about the relationship of war and nation states is that they're essentially held together by the idea of nationalism. And we see this very much today with our own armies, fighting for Britain, fighting for the Queen, fighting under a British flag as a coherent nation. And the idea of the nation is very much invoked. But if we think about the First World War, it's actually anachronistic to project the same kind of nationalism back to then, because we are really talking about empires. We're talking about a war fought by empires in defense of empire, which tends to reconfigure the imperial structures. So as Yinka's already mentioned, you've got the British, French and Russians fighting together, and the German, Italians, Austro-Hungarians. We also have the Japanese Empire coming in on the side of the British, the Portuguese pitch in as well on the Allied front. Why does this matter? I'd say this matters basically for four reasons we need to think about the imperial dimensions. So the first is to break apart that idea that it was national armies who fought the war. Now this is a picture of Moroccan Spahis in Belgium in October 1914. So at the very outbreak of the war, a number of soldiers and enforcers from the colonies were brought into Europe to fight on the Western Front and elsewhere. So the tirailleurs sénégalais, they fought in the Balkans. We had Indian soldiers from the British Army fighting in France and in Belgium. And it's clear that they had a very large role. So in terms of numbers, I have a rough estimate for some of those contingents, and they're not all remembered clearly. We had 1.5 million Indian soldiers fighting the war for the Allied side, of whom about 400,000 were Muslims. So this was the largest imperial contingent for Britain. There were also 400,000 Canadians, 16,000 from the West Indies, another 300,000 from Australia. We also have battalions from East and West Africa, also from South Africa. So this is really, in many senses, a multinational imperial war that's going on, but all fighting under a common flag. It's actually worth mentioning that the German establishment complained about the French and British using their imperial soldiers in Europe, because it was thought that actually the use of non-whites fighting alongside whites would diminish white prestige. And so the Germans were essentially criticizing the French for bringing savage troops into Europe, and they depicted them in a very racist way as being backwards and cannibalistic and so on. We do know that the French would use the Senegalese troops also as shock troops in trying to break through lines in the Balkans and so on. And partly it's because the opposing sides were afraid of and didn't understand African peoples in a way. The second reason that I think it's important to think about the imperial dimensions of the war. Now, this is a map of military engagements that's been put together by a collaborative project based at the University of Oxford. So this is where military engagements took place in the First World War in that period. And I know there's a few missing because I can see them, but even this limited representation gives you an idea of quite how global this war was. It was taking place with naval engagements in all of the oceans. There were bombardments and there were land wars. The first shots of the war were arguably fired in Togoland by Admiral Grunchi, I think his name was. And the war continued to take place across the entire globe. Wherever there was a British imperial installation, or a German one, or a French one, there would be some fighting, there would be some conflict. And this is really about what it means to be a great power in 1914. And that means taking and holding colonies. So we've just seen the role of the colonial soldiers and where the battles took place. What I want to draw attention to now is the ways in which being an imperial power was written into the identities of all of the major protagonists in the conflict. What it meant to be a civilized nation was to be a civilizing nation. Now, this picture is of the siege of Qingdao in China, which was a German port at the time, which Germany had leased some land. And Japan came in the war on the side of the British and essentially started bombarding the port, and the Germans did eventually retreat. But we don't hear necessarily about these battles because they don't make sense with the idea that you're fighting for a homeland. Why are you fighting for a port in Qingdao? This doesn't make sense unless you are invested in and committed to your imperial status. I should say, just as a footnote, I'm not trying to make a kind of highly polemic argument here to do with the imperial and colonial nature of the war, but you know, analytically, we're just losing a lot when we miss those dimensions. Finally, again, just to underscore the point, we don't think about the global production line that was involved with how the war carried on. So this is a bombing of the oil tanker in Madras in 1914 and this fuel tanker going up in flames. It was important not just to control territory, but also to control supply lines and to integrate all of the supply lines into the war effort. So, for example, in colonies where they grew cotton, such as in Portuguese East Africa, the demand for cotton rapidly increased, and that in turn had its effects on the colony. Also, 400,000 Chinese contract labourers were brought in to work on the British side in terms of the war effort. So this really is a globalised and globalising project. I would argue, actually, that the world was probably more globalised at the time of 1914 than in some respects it is now. Okay, so just to summarise, I mean, I think there's a provocation here in terms of how we think about what nations are, what states are, how wars are conducted, and by whom. And I think in the modern era, it's impossible to separate great power from colonial power.
And why do you think, what you've just been telling us, why do you think that's so often left out of the conventional narrative about the First World War, which is so focused on the Western Front?
I think there's a number of reasons. I mean, it's in the academic study of history, it's commonplace to acknowledge, of course, that history is written for people, for particular purposes. And one of the things that the story of the First World War does is create a narrative about a unified nation, and particularly a narrative about the unity between better off and worse off people, right? This is where the ordinary man fought alongside the upper class officer and both lived and died together. And it has an incredibly powerful unifying effect in that sense. It's also a story that we tell about progress, about modernity, so how women were brought into the workforce, how they won the right to vote on the back of that. So we're very focused on the effects that the war has in terms of the present-day national story, I think.
Now, Yinka's piece, the seesaw piece, is called End of Empire, and here's a philosophical question. Does empire ever really end?
If we think about the major forces that hold together the modern world, all of them have imperial origins, and many of them have imperial continuity. So in this sense, it doesn't really make any sense to distinguish between modernity and empire as forms. If we think about the way in which the global economy continues to be structured, the division of labour within it, how and where capital goes from, if we think about languages of development and liberal progress and so on, these are all things which were born in an imperial context. So on that side, I don't think empire really ends. Obviously, there are important differences that produce change. The racial hierarchy that underpinned a lot of the military as well as national ideology in the First World War has been discredited, and that continues to kind of have repercussions as people talk about what that meant.
I'm sure Barnaby would agree with this, but as news reporters at the BBC, I was always struck when I was doing foreign coverage that our coverage of the world is entirely through the lens of empire. So we're really not interested in what happens in Latin America, for instance, or French-speaking Africa. But it's very, very striking how we absorb that into everything.
But can I just add something to that then? Empire itself may not be at end, but I think for any kind of transformation, surely a psychological end is required in the mind of the people. Otherwise, you continue to perpetuate the same model. And I think that if there is to be some kind of change, and actually when I talk about imperialism, I also talk about that in a much broader sense. I actually talk about that to also mean patriarchy. And I think that feminism actually, yes, we know that patriarchy continues, but if patriarchy is to end, then there has to be a psychological shift. And I think the same thing does apply to those from the former colonies. Without a psychological shift, then there can't be any kind of formal transformation. I mean, that's what I think anyway. Mm-hmm. So then to say the end of empire is to imply a game-changing psychological shift, which is absolutely necessary as a foundation for to regain any kind of ground.
Now I'm going to come back to this because I think it's an interesting discussion, but I want to move on to Barnaby's presentation about his book, Another Man's War. And this takes us on to the Second World War, where, of course, an enormous amount of soldiers from the colonies also fought in that conflict.
I studied history, and I spent a lot of my childhood and then my professional career in Africa. So I've always been interested in Britain's links with Africa, and particularly actually with Nigeria. I used to be the BBC Nigeria correspondent. And when I was in Nigeria, this was at the turn of the millennium or so, I heard an awful lot about what in Nigeria are called the Burma Boys. These were the 100,000 African soldiers who Britain took to Burma, sent to Burma, during the Second World War to fight against the Japanese. And I wanted to do something about these soldiers. I'm not a military historian at all. I mean, talk of 5mm mortars or 8mm mortars leaves me cold. I barely know a battalion from a brigade, believe me. But I was interested in some of the other questions that have sort of echoed around this table tonight. Why did they go? Did they want to go? How were they treated? And what impact did their experiences have on them as individuals and to the colonies, soon to be independent countries, to which they returned? I knew as a journalist that I needed a good human story that would take me into this. And I didn't find one for many years until after I'd left Nigeria. And frankly, I thought I'd left it too late because that generation, of course, was fast disappearing. It was some 10 years later that I came across the story of a remarkable Nigerian man called Isaac Fadeyebo with a very, very extraordinary story. He was ambushed, signed up as a 16-year-old in his village in southwest Nigeria, taken to Burma, ambushed in the jungle, British officers with him killed. He's horribly injured, shot through the leg, a broken femur, shot through the stomach, with one other injured African soldier, a man from Sierra Leone who's shot in the ankle. The two of them incredibly survived for 9 months behind Japanese lines in the jungle. And Isaac was so sick and so wounded, he couldn't even crawl for the first few months. He had to drag himself. David Kagbo saved him by foraging for food, warning him when there were Japanese patrols. But they were also saved by local villagers who, at enormous risk to themselves, hid these two Africans in their hut, risking certain execution for the best part of a year. The British advanced back into this area in 1945. Isaac and David Kagbo were freed. They were taken back to West Africa. Isaac was briefly famous in Lagos in 1945. And then he lived the rest of his life, I would say, in a form of respectable obscurity as a mid-ranking civil servant in Lagos. But he never forgot the family that had saved him in Burma. 67 years later, I met Isaac in Lagos when he was in his mid-80s. And he said, I want you to take a letter and find these people in Burma who saved me and tell them that I'm thinking about them every single day. I was very skeptical that I would find them for various reasons, which I'll mention it in a moment. I did find them, and to my astonishment, discovered that they treasured the memories of these two African soldiers who they had saved almost 7 decades earlier. In my book, called Another Man's War, I tell Isaac's story, and then I try and weave in some of these deeper themes. Here we see soldiers being signed up in northern Nigeria in 1943. The British had great theories about martial races. They had those theories in India. They had them very much in Africa. They did a lot of their recruitment in northern Nigeria. But in the Second World War, they needed an awful lot more soldiers, so they had to expand to other areas of the colonies. Now, why did they go? Some were forced, and you would imagine that's probably the kind of answer you're expecting. There's definite anecdotes of press ganging, of people being taken from jails. Some, perhaps rather more romantically, actually wanted to fight against fascism. The British were very astute, especially in Nigeria, at using the idea of fighting Hitler and what Hitler would do to Africans. In fact, you can meet old women in Lagos who will tell you the rude songs they sang about Adolf Hitler in 1942 in Ibadan and Lagos. They called it Hitler's War. The British translated parts of Mein Kampf. There's a particular page or chapter in which Hitler says what he thinks about black people. You can imagine the sorts of things he says. And this propaganda was used very effectively. But I think the vast majority of Africans who signed up and who went, and this is an important point because there's a tendency for us, I think, to think of them as victims, signed up for exactly the same kinds of reasons that any one of us would sign up, which is that this was the best option available to them in their lives at that point in time. It made sense as a career option, if you like. The pay was good, the food was good, you'd get a uniform, you'd come back with more prestige. It doesn't mean you love King George, it doesn't mean you love the empire, you were just looking at the options that were open to you at that point in time. And I would, I suppose, pose the rhetorical question, how different is that from a 17-year-old in Huddersfield or Preston or Gloucester who went to Afghanistan or Iraq 10 years ago? This is the timeless story of why young men went to war, and it's why Isaac says he went to war. But, make no mistake, they were going to be in an army that was led by white officers in which they were black soldiers. The British in the late 1930s, probably realizing that a war with fascism was inevitable, hurriedly changed the rules and made it possible for essentially a non-white person to become a commissioned officer. That means a lieutenant, a captain, a proper rank. That was in theory. In practice, one African rose to the rank of lieutenant during the Second World War, a man from Ghana, and he would speak for the rest of his life of the racial hostility which he met in the officers' mess. Well, here they are, coming back, and most did come back, fortunately, although they were at the very bottom of the line in terms of priority in shipping. Lots of them didn't get back. This is Apapa docks in Lagos in 1946. Many of them didn't get back until the second half of late 1946. How did their experiences change them? And to what extent did their participation in the war hasten the process of African independence, which crept up on Africa and Britain far quicker than anyone would have imagined or conceived in 1945? Well, I think at a personal level, undoubtedly, traveling on a ship across the world for 6 weeks, seeing these great imperial cities, Bombay, Madras, Calcutta, fighting the Japanese, was an extraordinary, empowering process, provided, of course, you came back not wounded, you came back alive. For many African soldiers, and in fact, Isaac Fadeyobo is a case in point, he had an extraordinary revelation on the ship on the way out to India. Until then, in West Africa, the only white people he would have met were district officers, missionaries, senior colonial officers. And he's on this ship, and all these people have Liverpudlian and Brummie accents, and they're patting him on the back and offering him cigarettes and so on. And he suddenly realizes that perhaps for the first time in his life, he's meeting a white person who is not as well educated as he is. And the scales fall from his eyes. Now, there is then a rather romantic school of historical thought that says that these soldiers were, if you like, the vanguard of the independence movement thereafter. And there are certainly one or two wonderful anecdotes that suggest that. There's another Nigerian soldier called Marshal Kebi, and he has an incredible story. He's in Madras. Gandhi has just been freed by the British, and he says he's one black man amongst 1 million Indian faces. And he hears Gandhi speak about freedom, and afterwards he presses to the front and says, "What can I do to free my people in Africa?" It's a very romantic story. There are one or two others. There's a man called Wahiru Itoti, later better known in Britain as General China, a Mau Mau general in Kenya. Now, he fought in Burma, and in his autobiography, he talks about how he meets black American soldiers, how he meets socialist British soldiers, and they say to him, "What on earth are you doing fighting for the British Empire? Go back to Kenya and free your own country." Well, he does. He joins the Mau Mau, and he's pursued through the forests of Mount Kenya and the Aberdares by the British officers who had trained and fought alongside him in Burma. And in fact, when they eventually catch him and he's sentenced to death by hanging, they decide not to hang him because they remember him and he was a good chap, and so he's imprisoned instead. So there's some nice stories like that. There's a story from Ghana that some of you might know of how colonial soldiers who came back from Burma staged a protest. They hadn't received the money that was due to them. The British police turned their guns on them and shot dead 3 of these people who had recently come back from Burma. And there's a direct link then to protests sweeping through Ghana, which was then called the Gold Coast, and the hurried process of Britain withdrawing from that colony and it becoming the first independent black African colony. But by and large, I think you'll find that an awful lot of these soldiers were coming from less advantaged communities. They were coming from conservative rural areas, places like northern Nigeria. Yes, their own lives, their own perspectives might have changed, but they weren't really in a position to bring down the British Empire, even if it had occurred to them that they ought to do so. Now, I went to Burma to try and trace Isaac's story. And as I said, I was skeptical that I would find this family that had saved him. Isaac, by then, was in his mid-80s, and he was understandably sketchy on the details of where I should go. He knew that he'd been ambushed on the banks of the river Kaladan, which goes down from India through the Arakan, this terrible area where the Africans fought in the jungle. And he'd say, Barnaby, it's on the right-hand side of the river. You can't miss it if you're coming from India. And I would look at a map and I'd realize, well, Isaac, that means it's on the west-hand side of the river, but this river is 300 miles long, and so on. The other reason why I was very, very skeptical that I would find this family is that they belong to what the people who today we call the Rohingya, who are a persecuted minority. You might have heard of them in Burma. I'm calling it Burma because for the purposes of this story, it's Burma. Today, Myanmar. Many of them have been displaced in the years after the war. Many of the enmities in what is today Rakhine State, which was the Arakan, date back to the Second World War, and you can trace how the Buddhists, I'm simplifying it, supported the Japanese, and these people, the Rohingya Muslims, supported the British. And those echoes are still there in the same way that they reverberated around, say, the Balkans in the 1990s. I always felt the journalists who reported best on what happened in Bosnia knew who the Chetniks and partisans and Ustasis had been, what they had been doing where, and you see those echoes again. So I knew that these were people who were displaced, and I was very skeptical that I would find them. But when I went to the war memorial outside Rangoon, Yangon, and found all the African names, and found the names that Isaac had told me of his colleagues who had died alongside him, names from small villages in Nigeria and Ghana, families with whom he had had no contact for 70 years, I realized that I was onto something, and that gave me hope, and I did track down the family. And this is Isaac Fadiyebo. He was a lovely man, very modest, very self-effacing, and one of the reasons why I love his story is it's such a different interpretation of world wars to that which we're used to. And now I can talk about the Second World War. We tend to think about it in this country as a story of a heroic fight against fascism. We stood alone against Hitler in Europe. And all of that is true to some extent, and thank God we did. But Isaac and Shui Man, the man who saved him in Burma, and David Kagbo fought a very, very different kind of war. A war where they were sent to the other side of the world to protect a fading empire, ours, against a rising empire, Japan. It was my great satisfaction that I was able to make a film about Isaac's life, and he had a sort of late flurry of publicity, I suppose, in his final year. He died towards the end of 2012 in his mid-80s, surrounded happily by his family. Sadly, he'll never get the chance to read the book which I wrote, which I hope does justice to his life and the wider historical context, which is on sale here tonight, and I'm happy to sign copies. So I have to say
Thank you,
that.
Barnaby, for that. One thing is getting back to does empire ever end, where you can still see the legacy of empire in what's happening at the moment.
Yes, I can. Of course, for instance, I talked about the Rohingya people. I mean, there are many migrant crises going on in different parts of the world, and if we were talking about the migrant crisis sitting in Malaysia or Australia, we would be talking about the Rohingya. These same people are still running away, and they have many of the same problems that they had in the 1940s, in part because they supported the British. But closer to home, yes, Basil Davidson, the famous historian of Africa, wrote about the black man's burden, the burden that was left, that we left through drawing hastily lines on a map and creating weak and incoherent countries that didn't make sense. I think we were talking earlier about Sykes-Picot, that cynical carve-up of the post-Ottoman Empire done in secret by the French and the English almost precisely 100 years ago. I think it was in May of 1916 that they sat down together and drew lines across the troubled stretch of desert that now divides Syria and Iraq. So the echoes are there. I mean, I'm a historian, so I'm biased. I think it was William Faulkner who said that the past is not dead and buried, it's not even past yet. So.
Actually, there is one more thing, in fact, I can, which is that we thought it would be quite nice if we were to share stories about where our relatives were during World War I. I don't know if I warned you about this, Yinka. But, so I happen to mention that, unfortunately, I don't have a photograph, but my great-grandfather, who was a Scot, was in the Indian Civil Service, as a lot of Scots were, and he actually brought over a brigade of Indian workers to the Western Front, and they dug trenches. And then my grandfather, who was born in Calcutta, came back to England, went to school, went to university, and joined the RAF and died in the Second World War in the Battle of Britain. So, but he was born in India, and there's lots of connections in my family for that. So, Barnaby, I think you've got a picture, haven't you?
Yeah, I mean, I have a more conventional Western Front type story. Well, it's very brief. Well, this is my great-grandfather's grave, and in northern France, the three silver-haired ladies you can see in the distance, one of them's my mother. So they are three granddaughters. He was called Francis Bill Hubbard. He died in the very cold winter of 1917, from February 1917. He was only 32 years old. Of course, it's a short life, which almost by definition that they all were. And I'm afraid we don't have a photograph of him. Fortunately, you got on with your life very quickly in those days, and he'd had 3 children, including my grandfather, who was only 11 months old when Francis Bill Hubbard died. His wife, Eva, was a very interesting woman, and she lived on until the late 1940s, and she was an early feminist, I suppose you might call her, and a campaigner for women's suffrage, amongst other things, and that's his
And Yinka,
brief story.
did you have any relatives who were involved in that conflict, in the 1918 conflict?
Well, I mean, fortunately for my family, it's not really a military family. It was more of a Yoruba business family. So we didn't really, get involved in it. I mean, my family, I knew somebody who used to come to our house to cut hair, and he was quite an old man, and he had a lot of stories. And he knew people who'd been in the war, in the Second World War. But we were not directly, other than kind of stories, the kind of stories you hear in Lagos about people who'd been involved, but not necessarily,
And Mira?
directly.
Yes, so my family is from Sri Lanka, which was then Ceylon. So my great-grandfather on my mother's side worked on the railways in Ceylon, and the British were building railways in Malaya, and he was taken over, as were many Tamils from India and Ceylon, over to Malaya then, to work on the railway. So he started off as a signal operator and worked his way up. And during the war, he was essentially in charge of the Malaysian railway system, to his level. And he subsequently received an Imperial Service Medal, which was unusual at the time for a non-Brit.
Any other stories or questions for our panel? Yes, lady at the back.
Question for Yinka about British Library. The text reads that you have included the names of people who've contributed to arts and science and sport. And I want to ask you if there is anybody that you left off, if you discovered that they had contributed, that you decided not to include for any reason.
No, I don't think that anyone was particularly left out for any reasons, other than, obviously it's not possible to include everyone in a project like that. So you do have to select, hopefully, names that people might recognize. Often, I guess the ones who are recognized tend to be people who've done something that they've been recognized for, writers or scientists or, people who are in sports and so on. But there was no particular reason for actually choosing not to include people other than, practical reasons of scope and space that you can have for this kind of project.
I think it's quite subversive, but very skillful that you use humour to work your way in. Because I think, as you were suggesting, Kirsty, it's a very dark time, and there's a time when there's an awful lot of fear about migration and movement. And we live in a dangerous world, and we saw it again today, didn't we? But I think, going back to the migration crisis, we've also seen many, many positive stories that don't always get covered as well. I mean, for example, Greece, a country where I lived for 5 years as well, and it's in economic turmoil, but what you don't hear so much is the extraordinary human solidarity that so many Greeks have shown with the Syrians who wash up on their shores. When, we saw that heartbreaking picture of, what's he called, Alan Kurti, the little boy on the Turkish beach. Well, then, people in this country reacted financially. I know this because my wife works for Save the Children with extraordinary generosity. And I think it's all about seeing people as individuals and not numbers or not some concept of group identity. And that takes us back to British Library as well, because it reminds us of the power of the individual.
You spent a lot of your working artistic life on this subject, on the subject of conflict. How do you, with everything you've studied and portrayed in your work, interpret what's happening in the world today? And where would you place this wonderful term that we hear so much in news and current affairs, the markets? Do you see the markets as an imperialistic force? I.e. the financial markets, these people that meet in Davos and everything else. Do you see them as the new imperialists?
I mean, the world is complex, as you know. We've tried communism, keeping everybody the same, whilst killing their motivation at the same time. That didn't work, and people were not really successful in being the same. We've tried capitalism. The greedy guys will come along, taking all the money, eating all the cake, left some people with nothing. That didn't work either. So I think I favor the idea of the social entrepreneur. In other words, that you're always balancing. You don't kill people's creativity by saying they can't be capitalists. And you don't kill their innovative impulse. Because if you make everyone communist, then you kill their avant-garde, and you wouldn't have Apple, you wouldn't have Google, you wouldn't have any kind of, anyone that thinks outside the box. So you don't really want to do that. I think people should be, I'm a kind of, I guess I would consider myself a sort of liberal socialist, probably, with a champagne tinge to it. I think that you should actually, so I do believe in free markets, as long as you don't oppress people and you're very moral about what you're doing. But I don't think that you can have a world in which you're killing people's talents and you kill their enterprise. I think that's, for artists, that would be suicide, because they wouldn't have creativity and they wouldn't be able to challenge anything. So I think it's a balance, really, and we should learn from history. So, from the point of view of the market, go out to make money. I support that. But I think at the same time, be a nice person with it.
I'm just intrigued with your name, really. I know how people pronounce it and so on, but it's Yinka Shonibare. I just wonder whether you are related to any Shonibare at all in Ijebu, in Nigeria.
Okay, so the gentleman is clearly Nigerian from the way that from the way he pronounced my name. First of all, I'm not entirely bothered if my name is pronounced with an English sound, because when you speak English, there's a certain intonation, so you do pronounce accordingly. Well, it's just the Shonibare name in Nigeria. It's quite a well-known name, and there's another part of Nigeria that he referred to, and there's another branch of the family name from that part of Nigeria. But my own family are actually from Lagos. Yeah,
And
yeah, and yeah.
They are not related at all to.
No, we're not. No, we're not related to those. Yeah.
I come from Ijebu, and I know a lot of Shonibare's family in Ijebu, and that is why really I'm intrigued.
Okay.
To find out.
But it's a very prestigious name in Nigeria.
Both branches of the family.
Hi there, Yinka. I've also got a question about the End of Empire piece in the lobby there. This was made specifically for the Turner, as I understand from reading. So it's site-specific, if you like, with the North Sea in the background. And also the pivot, which looks like it could be off HMS Dreadnought or something like that. It's got that sort of gunmetal look. So my question, anyway, is where else could you show it? Is it specific? Is it only here, or is other venues? Had you thought about its future, sort of thing, as a piece?
It's good the work looks well here, but the work can travel. The notion of the resolution of conflict is a universal one. So that can work in Margate as well as it might work in Lagos or anywhere else. I think that the fundamental idea central to the work is the constant need to shift ground when you negotiate. And I think, unfortunately, a lot of the conflicts we have are based on the refusal to move from your position. And so the work, in a sense, is a metaphor for that. But at the same time, because this is most important when you look at my work, the work is never literal. I mean, there are other levels of engagement. There could be visual, there could be psychological, and there could be optical that a work of art, I think, must have. Therefore, you must be engaged on a number of levels.
On that note, I'll bring our discussion to an end, but I'd like to thank Yinka very much, and Mira Zavaratnam and Barnaby Phillips, and